New York Harbor, June 15, 1945. Oberhelferin Margarete Weber, Wehrmacht Communications Auxiliary, captured during the collapse of German forces in Italy, stands at the rail of the Liberty ship transporting 847 German prisoners of war toward America, observing through morning fog the Statue of Liberty emerging as the vessel approaches New York Harbor, where Nazi propaganda assured German military personnel that American industrial capacity had been crippled by strategic bombing. Racial strife had paralyzed American society, and material shortages prevented effective military mobilization comparable to Germany's total war effort. Her 2 years of service with Wehrmacht Signal Corps included extensive exposure to propaganda emphasizing American weakness, industrial incompetence, and societal collapse that German victory would inevitably exploit. What Oberhelferin Weber cannot possibly know, what no German military auxiliary could comprehend despite serving in communications roles providing her access to military intelligence summaries, is that the harbor she's entering services the world's largest concentration of shipyards that produced 2,710 Liberty ships plus hundreds of naval vessels during the war, while the city skyline, visible beyond, represents industrial and financial capacity that exceeded total German economic output by margins approaching 400%, and that over the next 6 weeks at POW processing facilities and eventual camp assignment, she and her fellow prisoners will witness American military infrastructure, industrial production, agricultural abundance, and civilian prosperity that systematically contradicts every element of Nazi propaganda they believed throughout the war, demonstrating how completely German leadership deceived its population about the true nature of the adversary they faced. Throughout Margarete Weber's military service from 1943 to 1945, Nazi propaganda broadcasts, military briefings, and official publications presented a consistent narrative about American weakness and inevitable German victory. The propaganda emphasized American industrial incompetence, claiming that democratic capitalism created inefficient production methods that German centralized planning surpassed systematically. Weekly newsreels showed carefully selected footage suggesting American racial tensions, labor strikes, and social disorder that Nazi commentators described as proof of democratic government failure. Military intelligence summaries distributed to Wehrmacht auxiliaries reinforced these themes, with reports emphasizing American military equipment quality problems, training inadequacies, and strategic incompetence that German professional military traditions would overcome despite temporary numerical advantages that American geography provided. The intelligence assessments, filtered through Nazi ideological frameworks, presented American industrial statistics through interpretations suggesting inflated propaganda numbers rather than genuine production achievements. Weber's fellow auxiliaries, women serving in communications, administrative, and support roles that freed German men for combat duty, absorbed this propaganda through daily exposure to controlled information sources that Nazi authorities curated to maintain morale and ideological commitment. The women serving as Nachrichtenhelferinnen, signals auxiliaries, Luftwaffenhelferinnen, Air Force auxiliaries, and various support roles received the same ideological indoctrination as combat soldiers, creating a shared worldview that American victory resulted from numerical superiority, rather than genuine industrial or military capability. What German prisoners approaching New York Harbor cannot comprehend is that Nazi propaganda systematically inverted reality, describing American strengths as weaknesses while portraying German weaknesses as temporary challenges that willpower would overcome. The industrial capacity they're about to witness represents systematic mobilization that German planning never achieved despite total war rhetoric, while American civilian prosperity, they'll observe, contradicts Nazi claims about American economic collapse under war strain. The mathematical reality hidden from German military personnel throughout the war is that American industrial production exceeded German output by margins that made German victory mathematically impossible once American mobilization reached full capacity during 1943 to 44. American factories produced 300,000 aircraft during the war versus German production of 120,000, manufactured 88,000 tanks versus German 67,000, and constructed 2,710 Liberty ships alone, more tonnage than German merchant marine possessed at war start, demonstrating industrial capacity that Nazi propaganda claimed didn't exist. German military auxiliaries' confidence throughout their service rested on ideological foundations emphasizing German racial and organizational superiority that Nazi education system instilled through years of systematic indoctrination. Weber's generation grew up during Nazi rule, experiencing Hitler Youth programs emphasizing German excellence, racial theories claiming Aryan superiority, and historical narratives describing German military traditions as world's finest. The women serving as Wehrmacht auxiliaries volunteered for military service, believing they contributed to righteous cause, defending European civilization against threats that Nazi propaganda described as existential. Their service in communications, administration, anti-aircraft units, and support roles reflected genuine commitment to German victory that ideological training created through systematic propaganda emphasizing duty, sacrifice, and national revival. Oberhelferin Anna Schmidt, serving alongside Weber in Wehrmacht's Signal Corps, maintained diary entries throughout 1944-45 describing confidence in German victory, despite military setbacks that she interpreted through propaganda frameworks suggesting temporary reverses before final triumph. Schmidt's writings reflect sincere belief in Nazi narratives about secret weapons, strategic withdrawals creating operational advantages, and American weaknesses that German resilience would exploit once proper circumstances emerged. The social context reinforced these beliefs, as German military personnel, including auxiliaries, operated within closed information environments where official sources provided only approved narratives, while alternative information sources faced severe penalties. The women serving in military roles received regular indoctrination through political education sessions, propaganda films, and controlled news sources that presented consistent worldview supporting continued resistance despite increasing evidence of impending defeat. Lieutenant Klaus Braun, Wehrmacht officer supervising auxiliary personnel captured with Weber's unit, maintained confidence in German cause through final weeks before capture, interpreting military collapse as temporary disorder rather than systemic defeat. Braun's conversations with auxiliary personnel emphasized themes about German resilience, American weakness, and ultimate German victory that propaganda maintained even as Allied forces overran German positions. What German prisoners approaching America cannot comprehend is the systematic transformation of American economy from peacetime production to military manufacturing that created industrial output exceeding all other combatant nations combined. The mobilization began in 1940 with Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy programs that converted automotive factories, appliance manufacturers, and consumer goods industries to military production through systematic planning that German war economy never achieved despite earlier mobilization's start. Henry Ford's Willow Run plant demonstrates this transformation most dramatically, converting from automotive production to B-24 Liberator bomber manufacturing through systematic application of assembly line techniques that produced one four-engine bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. The plant employed 42,000 workers operating 3 shifts, producing 8,685 bombers during 1942-45, more heavy bombers than total German four-engine aircraft production throughout the war. The Kaiser shipyards revolutionized naval construction through welding techniques replacing traditional riveting, modular construction methods allowing parallel assembly of ship sections, and systematic workflow management that reduced Liberty ship construction time from 244 days using traditional methods to average of 42 days, with record of 4 days, 15 hours for SS Robert E. Peary, demonstrating capabilities that German shipbuilding never approached. The industrial mobilization extended beyond weapons production to encompass complete military infrastructure, including training facilities, logistics networks, and support systems that German war economy never systematically developed. The United States constructed hundreds of military training bases, created standardized training programs producing uniformly qualified personnel, and established supply chains delivering equipment and supplies to forces operating globally, logistical capabilities that German military never achieved despite geographic advantages of continental European position. American agricultural productivity demonstrates additional systematic advantage, as mechanized farming fed both American population and Allied forces globally while maintaining civilian food consumption above pre-war levels. This agricultural abundance, achieved through mechanical equipment, chemical fertilizers, and scientific farming methods, contrasted sharply with German food shortages that required rationing increasingly severe as war progressed. As the Liberty ship carrying German POWs approaches New York Harbor during early morning of June 15th, the prisoners crowd the rails, observing American coastline with expectations shaped by Nazi propaganda describing bombed-out cities, collapsing infrastructure, and demoralized population that German newsreels suggested characterized American home front. Weber and fellow auxiliaries discuss expectations based on propaganda narratives, anticipating evidence of American weakness that would validate years of ideological training. The propaganda films showed American cities burning from air raids and civilians rioting over food shortages. Weber mentions to Schmidt, "We should observe evidence of the chaos they described." The prisoners scanned the approaching harbor, expecting confirmation of Nazi narratives about American societal collapse under war strain that propaganda repeatedly emphasized. Meanwhile, the American military personnel managing POW transport operations follow systematic procedures developed through processing hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners since 1943. The processing system reflects American organizational capacity, creating standardized methods for prisoner intake, classification, transportation, and detention that German POW administration never systematically developed despite capturing millions of Soviet prisoners. Captain James Morrison, commanding the military police company responsible for POW processing at Camp Shank's staging area, coordinates with transportation officers, medical personnel, and intelligence staff through procedures that routine training made automatic. Morrison's unit processes 2,000-plus POWs monthly through systematic intake, evaluating health, documenting identity, conducting initial intelligence screening, and assigning prisoners to appropriate detention facilities throughout continental United States. The contrast in organizational approaches becomes apparent through American systematic processing versus German prisoners' expectations of chaos that propaganda suggested characterized democratic military administration. The American procedures reflect industrial management principles applied to military administration, creating efficient processing that German prisoners never anticipated encountering. As the Liberty ship docks at Pier 92 in Manhattan during mid-morning, German prisoners observed their first direct evidence of American reality contradicting Nazi propaganda narratives. The pier facilities demonstrate modern construction, systematic organization, and operational efficiency that contradicts propaganda descriptions of American industrial incompetence. Multiple ships unload simultaneously at adjacent piers, while cargo handling equipment, cranes, forklifts, and conveyor systems operate with coordination suggesting systematic rather than chaotic operations. Weber observes through prisoner transport area windows the Manhattan skyline, whose scale and modernity contradicts propaganda suggestions about American architectural backwardness compared to German achievements. The Empire State Building, Chrysler Building, and dozens of additional skyscrapers represent construction capabilities and urban development that exceed anything in German cities, creating visual evidence immediately challenging propaganda narratives. The prisoner's first encounter with American military police provides additional contradiction to expected American weakness. The MPs demonstrate professional bearing, systematic procedures, and courteous but firm demeanor that contradicts propaganda characterizations of American soldiers as undisciplined and poorly trained. The processing proceeds efficiently through documentation, medical screening, and classification without chaos that propaganda suggested characterized American military administration. Private First Class Robert Chen, Chinese-American MP processing German prisoners, represents additional shock to prisoners whose racial theories emphasized Aryan superiority and predicted American racial diversity would prevent effective military coordination. Chen's professional competence and authority position contradict Nazi racial ideology, creating cognitive dissonance that begins eroding ideological certainty. The food provided during initial processing, white bread sandwiches, fresh fruit, milk, and coffee, demonstrates abundance that prisoners haven't experienced in months of German rations progressively deteriorating as supply situation collapsed during 1945. The quality and quantity of food provided to prisoners contradicts propaganda about American food shortages, suggesting either that propaganda lied or that Americans treat prisoners better than Germany treated its own soldiers during final war months. The prisoner transport by train from New York to POW Camp Clinton in Mississippi provides continuous exposure to American reality, systematically contradicting every element of Nazi propaganda. The rail journey, lasting 3 days with organized meal service and regular stops, allows prisoners to observe American countryside, cities, industrial facilities, and agricultural operations that demonstrate prosperity and productive capacity incompatible with propaganda narratives. Weber, observing through train windows during journey through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and southward, witnesses steel mills, automotive plants, and manufacturing facilities operating at full capacity with no evidence of bombing damage that propaganda claimed American cities suffered. The industrial facilities demonstrate scale exceeding anything in Germany, with individual American plants often larger than entire German industrial complexes. The agricultural landscapes observed during southward journey demonstrate mechanization and productivity that German agriculture never achieved despite Nazi emphasis on rural values and agricultural self-sufficiency. American farms featured tractors, mechanical harvesters, and scientific farming methods creating productivity that German manual labor-intensive agriculture could not match, explaining how America fed both its population and Allied forces globally, while Germany imposed increasingly severe food rationing. The civilian prosperity observed in cities and towns along the route provides perhaps the most shocking contradiction to propaganda narratives. American civilians appear well-fed, well-clothed, and engaged in normal commercial activities, suggesting that war burden fell primarily on military rather than disrupting civilian life fundamentally. The automobiles, consumer goods visible in store windows, and general prosperity contradict propaganda about American economic collapse under war strain. Oberhelfer and Schmidt begins articulating growing disbelief. Everything we were told appears to have been lies. The Americans aren't suffering, they're prosperous. Their industry isn't collapsing, it's operating at scales we never imagined. How could our leadership have been so completely wrong about the enemy we faced? The systematic contradiction of propaganda continues at Camp Clinton, where prisoners encounter modern facilities with running water, electrical power, adequate housing, and food service providing nutrition exceeding German military rations during final war year. The camp infrastructure demonstrates organizational capacity and resource allocation that German POW system never provided to captured Allied personnel, creating moral questions about German treatment of prisoners when Americans demonstrate humanitarian standards despite being propagandized as barbaric. By July 1945, German women POWs at Camp Clinton and other detention facilities throughout the United States confront psychological reckoning with the systematic deception that Nazi propaganda represented. Oberhelfer and Weber's letters to family in occupied Germany, subject to Allied censorship but allowed as humanitarian communication, reflect profound disillusionment. Quote, "Everything we were told about America was inverted from reality. They are not weak, but impossibly strong. Their society is not collapsing, but thriving. Their industrial capacity exceeds anything we imagined possible. We were sent to fight an enemy we never understood." End quote. The psychological impact extends throughout German POW population as thousands of captured personnel, military and civilian alike, process the cognitive dissonance between propaganda narratives and observed American reality. Camp educational programs, implemented by American authorities to facilitate democratic re-education, provide access to uncensored newspapers, newsreels showing actual war footage, and lectures describing American political and economic systems that Nazi ideology systematically misrepresented. Dr. Edward Davison, civilian educator contracted to develop POW re-education curriculum, describes the challenge. Quote, "These individuals spent years absorbing propaganda presenting America as decadent, weak, and chaotic. Confronting them with systematic evidence contradicting these beliefs creates psychological crisis as entire worldviews collapse. Some reject the evidence initially, others experience profound disillusionment with German leadership that deceived them so completely." End quote. The intellectual honesty many German POWs demonstrate when confronting evidence proves remarkable, with detailed discussions among prisoners analyzing how propaganda systematically inverted reality. Oberhelferin Schmidt's expanded diary entries document conversations among auxiliary personnel dissecting specific propaganda claims and comparing them with observed American reality, creating informal seminars where prisoners teach themselves about the deception they experienced. The moral reckoning proves equally significant, as prisoners confront implications of serving a regime that systematically lied about fundamental facts while committing atrocities that careful questioning by American intelligence officers begins revealing. The connection between propaganda deception about external enemies and internal crimes against humanity creates devastating recognition that ideology they served represented evil that truthful information might have exposed earlier. American authorities' decision to employ some German POWs in agricultural labor, allowed under Geneva Conventions, provides additional exposure to American society that further contradicts Nazi propaganda. Weber and other auxiliaries, assigned to agricultural work details on Mississippi farms, observe American rural life, family structures, and community organizations that demonstrate social cohesion and prosperity that propaganda claimed democratic societies could never achieve. The American families employing POW labor under military supervision demonstrate kindness and basic human decency that contradicts propaganda characterizations of Americans as cruel and uncivilized. Farm owner Margaret Sullivan, hosting German POW workers on her cotton farm, treats prisoners with respect while explaining American agricultural methods, family farming traditions, and community values that represent genuine democracy rather than propaganda caricatures. The American families we worked for shared meals with us, asked about our families in Germany, and treated us as human beings rather than enemies, Weber writes in August 1945 correspondence. The contradiction between their humanity and what we were taught about Americans creates shame that we believe the lies and serve the regime spreading them. The exposure to African American communities in Mississippi creates additional ideological challenges as prisoners observe racial segregation that Nazi propaganda cited as proof of American hypocrisy, yet also witness African American prosperity, education, and community organization that exceeded anything propaganda suggested. The complex reality, American racial problems existed, but within context of overall prosperity and opportunity, forced more nuanced understanding than Nazi racial ideology permitted. The religious diversity observed in American communities contradicts Nazi propaganda about American moral decay, with churches, synagogues, and community organizations demonstrating social cohesion through voluntary association rather than state coercion that Nazi Germany employed. The vitality of American civil society, achieved through freedom rather than totalitarian control, demonstrates that democratic pluralism creates stronger social bonds than authoritarian uniformity. Selected POW groups receive structured tours of American industrial facilities as part of re-education programs designed to demonstrate American economic capabilities that propaganda systematically misrepresented. Weber's group visits Ingalls Shipbuilding in Pascagoula, Mississippi, where systematic observation of warship construction provides concrete evidence of industrial capacity that made German victory mathematically impossible once American mobilization reached full capacity. The shipyard tour reveals construction methods that German industry never systematically implemented despite earlier industrialization. The modular construction techniques, assembly line workflows, and quality control systems demonstrate American industrial management excellence that Nazi propaganda dismissed as impossible under capitalist organization. The fact that private companies operating for profit achieved production efficiency exceeding German state-directed industry contradicts fundamental Nazi assumptions about economic organization. We observed them constructing destroyer escorts using methods that produce one vessel every 6 weeks, Schmidt writes in diary. German shipyards required 6 months for comparable vessels using traditional methods. The systematic application of industrial management to shipbuilding explains how they produced naval vessels faster than our submarines could sink them. We were fighting enemy whose industrial capacity we fundamentally misunderstood. Additional factory visits to aircraft plants, automotive facilities converted to tank production, and munitions factories provide overwhelming evidence of American industrial scale. The Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas, where some German POWs worked in support roles, demonstrated aircraft production at rates exceeding total German aviation industry output. The systematic production methods, quality control procedures, and worker training programs revealed American industrial sophistication that Nazi propaganda systematically denied. The economic education provided through these industrial exposures included lectures on American free enterprise, labor relations, and market economics that German prisoners found surprisingly effective compared to Nazi propaganda about capitalist chaos and exploitation. The evidence that American workers enjoyed higher living standards, better working conditions, and greater economic opportunity than German workers under Nazi socialism created ideological challenges that prisoner discussions addressed through increasingly sophisticated economic analysis. American re-education programs included systematic instruction on democratic governance, constitutional law, and civic participation that represented American political system accurately rather than through Nazi propaganda caricatures. Professor James Hendricks, political science instructor contracted for POW education, describes curriculum emphasizing comparative government, constitutional principles, and democratic theory through case studies and discussion rather than authoritarian indoctrination. The prisoners' exposure to American political debate through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and direct observation of American political discourse demonstrated democratic pluralism in practice rather than theory. The 1945 political discussions about post-war policy, demobilization debates, and domestic policy disagreements revealed that democratic disagreement strengthened rather than weakened American society, contrary to Nazi assumptions about democratic chaos. Weber's group attended structured lectures on American constitutional history, separation of powers, and federalism that explained how democratic institutions functioned effectively through systematic checks and balances rather than requiring authoritarian leadership principle that Nazi ideology claimed necessary for effective governance. The lectures encourage critical thinking and independent analysis rather than demanding ideological conformity, demonstrating democratic education methods contrasting sharply with Nazi indoctrination. The opportunity to observe local American governance through town meetings, county government, and community organizations provided concrete examples of democratic participation that propaganda claimed impossible. The effectiveness of local self-government, achieved through citizen participation rather than state direction, demonstrated that free societies could organize effectively through voluntary cooperation rather than coercion. Oberhelferin Anna Richter, former Luftwaffe auxiliary captured in 1945, writes about political awakening. The Americans taught us to think critically, question authority, and reach independent conclusions, exactly opposite of Nazi education demanding obedience and faith. This educational approach, which initially seemed chaotic, proved more effective in developing genuine understanding than years of Nazi indoctrination that demanded acceptance without questioning. The systematic exposure to American reality created personal transformations among German POWs that ranged from grudging acknowledgement of propaganda deception to genuine ideological conversion embracing democratic values. Weber's personal journey, documented through letters and post-war interviews, reflects progression from defensive denial through painful recognition to eventual acceptance of democratic principles as superior to totalitarian ideology she previously served. The transformation process proved psychologically difficult as accepting propaganda deception required acknowledging complicity in regime that evidence increasingly revealed committed unprecedented atrocities. American authorities' decision to show selected POW groups documentary evidence and photographs from liberated concentration camps created moral reckonings that forced prisoners to confront regime's true nature beyond propaganda's heroic narratives. When they showed us the photographs and films from the camps, many prisoners initially claimed the evidence was fabricated Allied propaganda, Weber writes. But as more evidence accumulated, and as we recognized that we had been deceived about everything else, the terrible truth became undeniable. We served evil that our leaders concealed through systematic lies about internal actions while feeding us propaganda about external enemies. The personal shame many prisoners experienced created depression and anger that American counselors and clergy helped prisoners process through individual discussions and group therapy sessions. The psychological support provided to POW population reflected American approach to re-education, emphasizing healing and transformation rather than punishment and humiliation, demonstrating humanitarian principles that propaganda claimed Americans lacked. Some prisoners resisted accepting evidence and clung to Nazi ideology despite overwhelming contradictions, demonstrating that ideological conversion cannot be forced, but requires individual choice to accept truth over comfortable lies. The American approach respected this autonomy while continuing to provide evidence and education, trusting that most individuals would eventually choose truth over propaganda when given genuine choice.
German POWs' repatriation to occupied Germany during 1946–47 provided opportunities to share their American experiences with German population that Nazi propaganda had similarly deceived. Weber and fellow auxiliaries returned to devastated Germany, where physical destruction and social collapse contrasted sharply with American prosperity they'd observed, creating additional evidence of Nazi regime's catastrophic failure. The former POWs became informal ambassadors, describing American reality to Germans who remained convinced that propaganda narratives held some truth. Their testimony, from individuals who served Nazi regime loyally and had no reason to favor Americans, carried credibility that official Allied information campaigns could not achieve. The systematic contradiction of propaganda through personal testimony helped undermine remaining Nazi ideology among German population. Weber's post-war career as educator in West Germany focused on teaching democratic values and warning against totalitarian ideologies through her personal testimony about propaganda deception and American reality. Her lectures to German youth emphasized critical thinking, skepticism toward government propaganda, and appreciation for democratic values through concrete examples from her experiences as POW. My responsibility now is teaching what I learned the hard way, that governments lie, propaganda inverts reality, and citizens must think critically rather than accepting official narratives uncritically, Weber tells students in 1950s lectures. The Americans taught me to question authority and seek truth through evidence rather than accepting propaganda through faith. This lesson, learned through painful confrontation with my own gullibility, represents most valuable education I received. The broader legacy of German POW experiences in America influenced post-war German democracy through creating a cohort of individuals who experienced American democratic values directly and could testify authentically about democratic governance's superiority over totalitarian alternatives. The Federal Republic of Germany's successful democratization owed partial debt to these informal ambassadors who described American reality through personal experience rather than propaganda.
The German POW experience in America demonstrates how systematic propaganda creates alternate realities that collapse when confronted with genuine evidence, while revealing human capacity for ideological conversion when truth receives honest consideration. The story illustrates dangers of closed information systems, where governments control all information sources, preventing citizens from accessing alternative perspectives that might reveal propaganda deception. The American decision to treat POWs humanely while exposing them to democratic values and accurate information proved more effective at undermining Nazi ideology than punishment or humiliation would have achieved. This approach reflected confidence in truth's power to convince when presented fairly, rather than imposed through force, demonstrating democratic values through practice, rather than propaganda. The historical documentation of POW experiences, through letters, diaries, post-war interviews, and memoirs, provides invaluable testimony about propaganda's psychological effects and truth's eventual triumph when individuals receive genuine choice. These personal narratives reveal that most humans prefer truth over comfortable lies, once evidence makes continuing self-deception impossible. The experience also demonstrates that even individuals raised under totalitarian indoctrination retain capacity for critical thinking and moral reasoning when exposed to alternative information and encouraged to think independently. The systematic propagandist collapse when confronted with reality suggests that truth possesses inherent advantages over lies when information flow cannot be completely controlled. The final lesson emphasizes the importance of free information exchange, independent media, and educational systems teaching critical thinking rather than demanding ideological conformity. Societies permitting genuine debate and protecting information freedom prove more resilient than authoritarian systems depending on propaganda maintenance through information control and forced conformity.